Welcome to this special edition of the SYS podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. Today I'm going to try and help people figure out how they can estimate the budget of their screenplay, and this is all in conjunction with the SYS six-figure screenplay contest. Just go to www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/contest to learn more about that. We've lined up about 40 industry pros as judges. You can go to the contest landing page and see all of those names as well as links to their IMDb page. The idea for this contest was simple: find the best low-budget scripts and present them to the industry. I'm defining low budget as less than $1 million US. In other words, six figures or less. If you have any questions about how to figure out the budget of your screenplay, hopefully this video will help you. Once again, if this sounds like something you'd like to learn more about or perhaps even enter, just go to www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/contest. Okay, so how do you know if your film could be produced for less than $1 million? Without running a full budget on the project, you really won't know for sure, but there are some guidelines that can get you very, very close. And in fact, if you hire a line producer to run a complete budget on the project, the first thing that he or she will ask you is, what number do you want me to hit? And they'll try and back into that number. Now, they may come back to you and say there's no way it can be done on that budget, but usually an experienced producer who hires a line producer understands budget enough and can estimate the budget using common sense and some basic guidelines so that that producer gets close enough to a realistic number so that then they can tell the line producer, and then the line producer can back into the number that the producer wants. That's honestly how a lot of these budgets are made, and there's some push and pull. It's not all just here's the script, what does it cost? The other thing, and really listen to what I'm about to say here because this is very, very important. You could give your script to 3 different very experienced producers and they could all come back to you with very different numbers. And it's not because one producer is wrong or one producer is better than the other. Different producers come at each project with different experiences. One producer might read a script and he may simply just not want to do a script on the amount of money that you would be proposing. Another producer might be very happy to do that same script and thinks he can do a great job on that script. I mean, different producers have different angles that they're coming at. They have different distributors that they work at. So there's different levels of films that need to be produced in different, for a variety of different channels, different avenues. So there's just a lot more that goes into the budget than just purely, here's the script, let's figure it out. There's a lot of science, obviously, with budgeting. I mean, how much does a permit cost? I mean, that's a fairly objective number. How much does it cost to, rent a helicopter and go shoot a bunch of shots? All these things are things you can definitely figure out, and a good line producer knows how to figure that stuff out. I don't think those are the kinds of things you guys need to worry about as a screenwriter. But again, just keep in mind that yes, there's a lot of science in budgeting these films, but there also is a lot of art just in the touch and go nature of these things, and maybe calling in favors. It's just, you never quite know exactly what a film is going to cost. So don't get too fixated on figuring out exactly how much your film or your script is going to cost. There is no such objective number. Okay, so let's talk about some of the guidelines that these producers might use just to kind of estimate the budget quickly. First, don't worry too much about what they call the below-the-line costs. This is all the crew except the director, writer, and producer, and also not the actors, although they're not considered crew either. So basically, the above-the-line costs are the actors, writer, director, and producer. The below-the-line costs are everyone else. In other words, your cinematographer, editor, costume designer, grips, gaffers, electrician, hair, makeup, catering, everybody else. Those costs are sort of like fixed costs. I mean, as you go up in budget, obviously Spielberg is paying a lot for his cinematographer because he's got, one of the 5 best, he's got one of the 5 most distinguished cinematographers working for him. That guy is in demand. He's going to be able to get the most rates. So yes, the costs are not exactly fixed, but there is not a ton of difference between a $200,000 movie, a $500,000 movie, or even $1 million movie in terms of what you have to pay for crew or post-production or or a score or music or any of those things. Those things are pretty much a fixed cost, and $1 million budget is more than enough to take care of all of those costs and hire quality people. So again, don't worry too much about getting into the weeds on the costs of these types of things. It's not going to vary too much between scripts, especially ones where you as the writer are using some amount of common sense to know that the script is probably workable at the sub $1 million level. So again, don't worry about those types of costs. Okay, so that leaves the things that you do need to worry about in terms of budget. So let's talk about the most obvious one right off the bat: cast. Again, for the purpose of estimating the budget, you just have to assume you're not going to get any name A-list talent. That doesn't mean you're not going to get some actors you've heard of, but you're not going to get Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt. I mean, who knows? I mean, if this podcast is still being listened to in 20 years, that might be exactly the type of movie that those guys are doing in 20 years. So as of I write this or produce this this little podcast here in 2020, Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, they're not doing sub $1 million movies. So the bottom line, assuming you have a normal cast needs, this shouldn't be a problem. One little caveat I do want to say: go look at the movies that are coming through my system here at Selling Your Screenplay, the movies that I'm reviewing, the movies where I'm talking to the filmmakers on my podcast. The vast majority of those films are made for less than $1 million, and in almost, I would say, at least half of the movies that come up there, they have some what you would call name cast. It's just not A-list talent, but there's certainly some movies with big name people that you've heard of. But again, we're not talking about that A-list talent of Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt. Okay, so assuming you don't have any oddball casting needs, cast isn't going to be the thing that pushes you over the $1 million. Again, with the one caveat that you are accepting the fact that Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise are not going to be in this sub $1 million movie. But there are a few casting things that you should watch out for and that might impact the budget. If you have large crowd scenes where you need thousands of extras, that could be a problem. Obviously, you have to pay all those extras, but just in terms of production, if you need hundreds or thousands of people, it means shutting down streets, hiring police to make sure everything is done safely. It means more food, more PAs to manage all those people. It's hard to actually manage thousands of people, so those scenes are usually very slow to shoot. Again, slower shooting means more money. You're spending, you're shooting less of the script every day because you're trying to orchestrate these large crowd scenes. So it can get expensive quick. It's just one, now again, if it's just one quick scene at a mall or maybe even in some sort of open space where you do have a lot of extras, if it's just one scene in the movie, you can probably get away with it in a sub $1 million movie, but it can't be prevalent in your script. You can't have multiple really huge large crowd scenes. I mean, you're not going to shut down Dodger Stadium with a packed house on a sub $1 million movie. It just, those scenes are very expensive. A lot goes into them, and you're not going to find a producer, I don't think, that would ever want to take on something like that on a less than $1 million budget. If you have some really oddball casting requirements, like being John Malkovich, you pretty much needed John Malkovich to be in that movie. I suppose you could have rewritten it for the star you had, maybe, but again, you sort of needed like a movie star or someone, renowned for their acting ability in that role, and that could be expensive. So there could be some sort of oddball casting requirements. I tried to think of some examples, and frankly, I know my John Malkovich example is not a great example. On my own script, like with The Pinch, I had to cast a really big guy. That was really what was the most important thing about this character, is this big, intimidating physical presence. And there just weren't a lot of those guys out there in Hollywood. So my choices were somewhat limited. You might run into something like that too. If you write your script and it needs a very, very particular person, you might have a hard time finding that. And if you found someone that had the acting chops to be able to do the role, it might be expensive. So there might be something weird there, but I'll let you think about that as far as just whatever oddball casting needs might be in your script. Again, normal casting needs, that's not going to be the thing that pushes you over $1 million. Okay, so let's talk about costumes and just the setting in general. Period pieces are usually expensive. probably not done on $1 million budget. You have to pay for all the costumes. Obviously, you have to get period cars, or if it's before cars, horses, buggies. You have to redress all the sets. Obviously, especially for an indie film, it's very easy to just go into a building and start shooting. Maybe you have a production designer that kind of cleans things up, brings in some props. But if you're shooting, 1880s and you go into a bar, it's, you can't have any cell phones. You can't have really any electric lights. I mean, you can't have anything that would be sort of modern technology. And that stuff is expensive. Your production designer has to go in there. You either have to build that set, or you have to go into an an already existing set and really turn it into stuff. Again, it could be done. It's no problem. This is what movies are all about. But that stuff does cost money. So again, if it's somewhat contained, you might be able to get away with it. But it's going to be tough. Period pieces are going to be tough on $1 million budget. If it's a super small cast that takes place in just 1 or 2 locations, even if it's a period piece, then maybe you could do it for just $1 million. But it's going to need to be super simple, except for the period piece aspect. Creature features with a monster. Again, that sort of stuff can definitely be done on $1 million budget. You can buy very sophisticated costumes these days relatively cheaply. And when I say relatively cheaply, I've heard of people buying really, robust, realistic-looking costumes somewhere in that $5,000 to $10,000 range, which, when you're talking about a budget of $1 million, is not a big deal. Now, again, you can't have every character in your movie wearing, you can't have, 50 characters wearing elaborate costumes. So that's got to be kind of taken into consideration. Budget is a thing. You cannot afford to spend $10,000, even I would say on 10 actors, $10,000 worth of costumes on 10 actors. That would be $100,000 of your budget on $1 million. Again, maybe not, but I would say if you need extensive costuming, whether it be a period piece or sci-fi or a creature feature, something like that, might not be a good fit for a low-budget film. Locations, again, this is a very similar what I just said with costumes. If you can use normal sort of contemporary sets like houses, apartments, backyards, even a woods in a backyard, parks, warehouses, gas stations, campgrounds, restaurants, coffee shops, offices, front lawns, stores, gas stations, all that sort of stuff that we find and we interact with on an almost daily basis. Those types of locations are usually fairly easy to find anywhere in the world, and they are usually fairly inexpensive. I mean, you can find someplace, even in Hollywood, you could find a gas station that would, for $1,000 a day, you could definitely pull up and shoot a scene at a gas station. Like, you could definitely find that, and that's well within the budget of something like this. Now, I mentioned Dodger Stadium above. Obviously, again, it's very expensive to shut down an MLB stadium, so keep that in mind. If you need to shoot in the Empire State Building, that could get pricey. If your script takes place mostly in a spaceship, that could get tricky on $1 million budget. Again, you got to build those sets, potentially, whether that be models or CGI. Again, if it's just 1 or 2 sets that you have to build, you're probably okay. But you can't set your entire film in space, utilize dozens of sci-fi sets and locations, and expect it to come in at $1 million or even $20 million for that matter. The other thing I'll say about locations is company moves are expensive. In other words, moving all of that gear and the crew from one location to another, it takes a lot of time, and time is money. So, if you got to drive across town, pack up all your gear and drive across town to shoot some little scene, that's going to impact your budget. You're spending time packing the truck, driving the truck, unpacking the truck, getting set up, instead of time shooting. So again, I think the general idea of a one location film is taking things a bit far. Certainly on $1 million budget, you can have multiple locations, and you can do quite a lot, as I said, on the $1 million budget. But I wouldn't think that you certainly wouldn't have much more than like maybe 10 or 15 sort of main locations on $1 million budget. And when I say location, I'm not talking about like bedroom and kitchen. I'm talking about, if it's a house, then the bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, maybe the backyard, the woods in the backyard, the garage, all that's kind of considered one location. I'm not talking about just specific slug lines. But again, you got to look at your script, and it's a very sort of a specific thing. If you're utilizing all sort of the common locations. You've got maybe 15 or 20 very distinct different locations. You're probably okay for $1 million movie. But you can't have, on $1 million budget, you can't have 60 different locations that are completely distinct, and you can't have just really, really distinct locations in terms of, a third of the movie takes place in Minnesota, a third of it takes place in Hawaii, and a third of it in Paris. I mean, those are very distinct locations. You won't be able to, on $1 million budget, it would look really cheap to try and make Malibu look like Hawaii. You might be able to get away with that, but it's going to be tough to make LA look like Paris. And so again, you start cutting into the quality of your movie, and you can't afford to make. I mean, those are more than just company moves. That's like a whole nother crew. You'd have to hire a whole nother crew in another country. I'm not saying there's no absolutes, but I can't see a producer really being interested in something that was that on $1 million budget be that difficult to produce with multiple international crews and that kind of stuff. I think that would probably be outside the scope of $1 million film. Now, you can consolidate locations. When I'm talking about all these locations, for instance, on the movie that I just did, The Rideshare Killer, we had one location in Burbank. We used it as a police interior. We didn't use we shot the exterior of a real police station. We'll see how that turns out. But then the interior we just took and we turned in an office. So it was the interior of the police station. We also used it as an interrogation room. I guess that would also be in the police station. We used the back of that exact same building as like a little alleyway where one of the people gets killed, and we use the front of that building as like a restaurant where someone exits and then gets into the car. Again, we didn't have to do any company moves. We shot all of those scenes there. In the movie, you'll never know that they're all one location, but there is a certain amount of consolidating locations. And again, well, how do I know? Like, obviously you're trying to estimate your budget. How will you know if you can consolidate those locations? Well, again, you won't know for sure, but if you stick to those main locations that I was talking about, apartments, houses, yards, garages, if you stick to those sorts of locations, you will be able to consolidate some of the locations for sure, because there are some places that, hey, this garage would look great, and we can also double it we can also double, the next room as a police station office. You start to get into more exotic locations. Hey, we got to have Stonehenge. These people have to be at Stonehenge when they have this scene. That's difficult. I mean, you can't really fake that on a really low budget. It would be tough to fake that, and it would be expensive to go do it. And if that's really, really important to your story, the actors have to have a pivotal scene at Stonehenge, but they also have to have a pivotal scene in St. Louis. I don't know that that's a film that could really be shot on $1 million. Again, there's no absolutes. It would depend on a lot of the other factors, but locations is definitely a big expense. Okay, so let's talk about the stunts and special effects, and I'm not including CGI, which is all the computer effects that are done in post-production. I will talk about that in a second. When thinking about stunts and special effects, just remember one thing: danger is expensive. One stunt or one car chase on $1 million budget, you can probably get away with. And you'll see this is kind of a reoccurring theme. If there's just one sort of set piece, big set piece on $1 million budget, you can probably work it in. But no more than one, and it's got to be a fairly simple one at that. Stunts like car chases are obviously dangerous. High speed cars are banging into each other, so you have to hire the proper people. You have to have stunt guys, you have to have special effects guys with experience that know how to engineer these stunts. You have to have police on duty to manage traffic. I'm sure firemen, you got to pay them to sit around in case there's a fire. Ambulance, you have to have paramedics on site. So there's just a lot of logistics to actually filming these stunts. But that's a lot of times movies have that, and a lot of times, especially with these lower budget $1 million movies, you might want to spend a day or two getting that one stunt, and maybe it's only a quarter page in the script. You spend some money, that becomes your trailer moment, but it's not a big deal. Again, one pretty simple stunt or car chase or explosion or something, we can get away with. It's when it starts to sort of be prevalent in the script, I start to think, well, maybe this isn't $1 million movie. The other thing I just remembered too in my outline was insurance. One of the things they're going to ask you when you're getting insurance for your production are there guns, are there fires, and these sorts of, essentially, is there anything dangerous? And obviously, if you have things that are dangerous on set, the insurance goes up. That will cost, substantially more. So the stunts are expensive is the bottom line. Any sort of practical effect like a burning building, obviously that's potentially expensive. Blowing stuff up, shooting guns on set, even with blanks, is dangerous, so you've got to hire the proper people. Make sure that they have everything they need to do the stunts safely. Again, this isn't to say you can't have stunts or special effects or guns in your film, but it can't be effects or stunt heavy. You'll notice a good number of low budget action films are martial arts types films. I mean, that's because, at least in part, with hand-to-hand fighting, you just need some skilled actors to do the choreography for the action, but you don't need to shut down a street, make sure you have a fire marshal, etc., etc. So, and the other thing is especially in modern day, a lot of the special effects nowadays, like gunshots, explosions, burning buildings, a lot of that stuff can be done in post-production, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So the good news here with the computer effects, the CGI, the post-production effects, the good news here is that all of this sort of technology is constantly getting more powerful and cheaper, but it's still fairly expensive if you want to look at the really high-end effects. So again, if your script needs some CGI, like maybe removing an actor's legs or on one or two scenes, or maybe even a creature. I know there have been some dinosaur movies, little alien movies that have come through the SYS podcast. Again, one creature. I wrote a movie called Snake Outta Compton, and the entire snake was done in CGI, and the snake is pretty prominent. Can't honestly say it looks all that great. It was a spoof, so it's the cheesiness of it is kind of part of its shtick. But again, that movie was definitely well under $1 million. So again, you can have some CGI, but it's not going to be Avatar. It's not going to be Marvel. It's not going to be the really high-end stuff. So you want to kind of consider that. Okay, so hopefully that lays out some big passes at where the money goes in the film, so you can at least start to estimate your budget a little bit. What I thought I would do now is run through some actual films that you've hopefully heard of and seen, and try and apply what I just talked about, so that you can then hopefully apply these same guidelines to your own script. There are some obvious examples: Clerks, Brothers McMullen, The Blair Witch Project, Paranormal Activity. Again, these are all great examples of low-budget films, contemporary stories. They all took place in just modern-day society. The casts were all fairly small. There's not any huge, scenes with big crowds in any of these films. The locations were very, very limited. And all the locations were very much normal places. In the case of Clerks, I think I read Kevin Smith actually worked there, had a friend that worked there in that little convenience store. So that was someplace that he knew he could shoot at. Obviously, Paranormal Activity took place all in one house. That was sort of the premise of the thing, was setting up these cameras. So again, just being creative and sort of using what you have. There were no stars in any of these films, no name talent. In fact, most of the actors in them didn't have a lot of experience. So again, you can even go with inexperienced actors and still have some success. Pretty much these types of films, they hit all the check boxes for being low budget, all the stuff I just mentioned. So if you've got a script like this, no questions. Obviously, it could be made for less than $1 million. But let's talk about some bigger films. And I'm just going to throw out a bunch of random films that I thought were good examples of films that I could just quickly demonstrate sort of where the budget went and why the budget landed where I think it did land. So the first film I want to mention is Juno. It's a great example of a fairly contained indie dramedy, witty dialogue. It's character driven, very much grounded, takes place modern society dealing with, modern problems, teen pregnancy and stuff is contemporary location, contemporary problem. There's no fights or stunts. There's no need for any major special effects. There's a few scenes in high school, if my memory is correct, where there are definitely going to be some actors that you need for extras, and so that will definitely add up a little bit. But again, all the locations are contemporary, so there's not a ton of set dressing you'd need to make to that high school. But you'd probably have to get a high school for a few days to shoot, and then hire all the extras, that sort of stuff. Again, just that one sort of set piece, that one location, not a big deal for $1 million budget. On the Wikipedia page, it actually lists the Juno budget as $6.5 to $7.5 million. And that feels about right to me. A lot of times on Wikipedia, I'll look up a movie and I'm like, yeah, there's no way that film costs that. This one feels about right to me. Could it be a little more? Could be a little less, but I think that's a ballpark number. Let's just say 7 million. And that's okay. That doesn't mean this film couldn't have been made for $1 million. Just the fact that they spent $7 million. They had a very much a great cast. Again, you're not going to get Jennifer Garner and Jason Bateman in a $1 million film, most likely. Maybe Jennifer Garner's star has definitely fallen over the last couple of years. So maybe you could get her in the right $1 million project if she really wanted to do it. Jason Bateman, I think he's still doing a lot of studio stuff. I know he's got some shows on Netflix and that kind of stuff. So I don't know that he would do a $1 million film, but that's sort of the thing. You could remove them and you would still have you potentially could still have a pretty good film. And that's, you cut out the cast, the expense that they paid to the cast, and you cut out sort of the studio system. You'd have no problem producing Juno on the sub $1 million level. And the important thing is, looking at that film, watching that movie, is there $1 million version of that film that could potentially work? And, the answer is yes. There's definitely $1 million version of Juno that could work, despite the fact that they spent more than $1 million. So another film I want to mention is called The Platform. I just watched it over on Netflix. It's a Netflix original. If you have Netflix, I highly recommend it. It's a really cool film, or at least I thought so. It's sci-fi, but it's very limited in its scope. It all takes place in basically one location, which is this sort of futuristic prison, and it has this platform of food that gets lowered down. My guess is the filmmakers spent more than $1 million on this film. It's a pretty slick production, but there's no name cast to speak of. I mean, there's no actors in there that they had to pay multiple millions of dollars for. And the cast that they did have was also pretty limited. I bet there's not more than 10 or 12 speaking roles in the entire film. Again, it really almost all takes place in this sort of futuristic prison. And the futuristic prison is just this one room with this platform that lowers down. They can look down into the other rooms from this hole where the platform gets lowered through. But you could probably do that with some sort of CGI, some sort of post-production. Maybe some practical effects would go along with some of that sort of stuff. But again, it's very contained, not a ton of actors. So this feels like the type of sci-fi film that could be done for about $1 million. Interesting, I would say, this is sort of a side note, interesting, I would say if this was an American indie film, like if this script had landed with an American indie producer, I looked at the names and they looked like it was foreign. It did not look like it was an American film, just based on the names of all the cast and crew. I could be totally wrong about this, but the other thing is it's a Netflix movie, and that has some bearing on what I'm about to say. But in any event, I think if this script landed with an American indie producer, I think you would probably have found less production value, but more cast. They would have put more of the money into cast and less in production value. And that just has to do with the fact that for these indie films to really work, you do need some cast. Again, we're not talking Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt. We're talking more of the types of actors that you see in the films that I'm reviewing here on the SYS podcast. But you need those names in a film, in an indie film, to sell it. In this case, it went on Netflix. Netflix already has an audience, so they probably don't necessarily care. They don't need that hook of having a really big name necessarily. If they like the film, they can plug it into their system and they're going to get a lot of views. Just like myself, they just pushed it up in their algorithm so that it was showing up to me, and eventually it just looked cool. So I just clicked on it, started watching it, and it was good. So it hooked me, and I watched it all the way through. But again, bottom line, this is the sort of sci-fi film that I think could be done very well for less than $1 million. So I want to talk about a film briefly here that was featured on the SYS podcast. And I keep going back to this, saying, hey, the actors that are, the type of actor that's featured in these films that are coming through my podcast, because I do think that there is kind of a misconception with the general world out there that, when people say, oh, A-list talent or B-list talent, it's, the A-list talent are the Tom Cruises and the Brad Pitts, the guys that are at the top of the George Clooney. I mean, these are guys that have been up for Academy Award nominations. They are box office. They have a lot of box office, clout. They sell movies. They've been in a number of big hits. They're considered good actors. So they have sort of the whole sort of package, and they're at the top of their game. I mean, Tom Cruise, I was joking earlier, but, in 20 years, I don't know, he's got to be pushing 60 now, but in 20 years when he's 80, 85, he might be willing to star in a sub-$1 million movie, just if it's a cool film and you were able to approach him at the right thing. But the bottom line is, and the reason I want to mention this film, and it's called The Rewrite, and it was one that I reviewed years ago on the SYS podcast, but it had Hugh Grant and Marissa Tomei, along with a number of very notable cast members. I actually interviewed the director, Mark Lawrence. And again, I mentioned this one obviously because Hugh Grant, he is, or at least was, a big movie star. Marissa Tomei is Academy Award winning actress. So for an indie film, this had a great cast. But again, I really would guess, I don't know Mark Lawrence, I didn't have any discussions with him about budget, so I just don't really know for sure. But my guess is this film was made for less than $1 million. So I just want to give the audience some idea that, these sub-$1 million movies, it doesn't mean you're just going to end up with some B actor that you never heard of. No, we're talking about guys that, are sort of still fairly famous, like Hugh Grant, but are past his, what I would call his acting prime. He's not getting a ton of studio work these days. So, he's an actor, he wants to work. So he's probably looking at projects, indie projects, and if he likes the director or he likes the script, he's a guy like that is probably willing to work on a sub-$1 million movies. Again, Tom Cruise is still doing Mission Impossible, so he's not going to do those $1 million movies anytime soon, let's say. So, but again, that's where I think that they spent the money for this movie called The Rewrite. They spent it on the cast. If the budget was, again, I don't have any inside information here, but let's just say if the budget was around $1 million, they probably spent half or maybe even more than half on those 4 or 5 main actors. But this film otherwise was very, very simple. It's about a college professor who teaches a writing class. So again, schools, houses, I think they go to the school bookstore. There's some classrooms. All the locations are fairly easy to get. And again, I was talking about company moves. They probably could be strategic enough. They probably found a university that was willing to let them shoot, and they probably were able to cut some sort of a deal. Okay, we're going to shoot here. And that college bookstore, there's probably a classroom that's just 40 feet down the hallway that they could also use, so they didn't have to do big company moves. They could pull up their truck of grip equipment, unpack it, shoot both scenes. So again, when you're talking about it like a college campus and like if your movie takes place on a college campus, that's no problem, even if it's all kinds of different locations on that college campus. It's not going to be a problem because you're not going to have to do these big massive moves across town or across the world or whatever. So again, another good movie to look at if you're talking about cast, like what's the best cast you could probably have for a sub-$1 million movies? I would say The Rewrite is probably right up there. Okay, so let's talk about Memento. As far as thrillers go, I think Memento is a great example of a really cool concept that was executed really well. And again, fairly low budget film. Think about all the locations that were in Memento. There's hotels, bars, restaurants, houses, a couple of stores, and then some abandoned industrial area at the end. But again, all these places are pretty easy to find. They're sort of normal places that we could find in any American city here in 2020. Everything, it was a contemporary story, so all the clothes, the cars, the set dressing, all relatively straightforward. The whole gimmick with the story unfolding backwards lended itself very well to low budget. That's bonus points. I mentioned Paranormal Activity, Blair Witch. Again, they sort of embrace the sort of the low budget aesthetic, and it sort of becomes a part of the script. In the case of Memento, it's a sort of neo-noir, film noir, it's a sort of neo-noir, and film noir has its roots in low-budget filmmaking. So that sort of aesthetic, that was sort of a gritty, real aesthetic, that Memento had, and I think it worked really well for there. Again, budget would not have improved the film very much. They could have spent more money on this film, but they had great acting, great directing, great story. I don't really know where you would have spent any more money. They probably spent more than $1 million, truthfully. I don't know what the budget on that was, but again, there's definitely a good, solid version of Memento, and a lot of that is because the script is just so inventive, so original, and so interesting. And because of all these other things, like it's contemporary and blah blah blah, it wouldn't be super expensive, but you could do a much lower budget version of Memento, and still you could probably come out with a pretty good film. One film that I was thinking about for this section was The Usual Suspects. It's a pretty straightforward story, at least in terms of production budget. I mean, it's contemporary. There's nothing too outrageous in terms of locations or costumes or anything, but there is a ton of locations. They go to a number of different places. They go to different parts of the country. And so I can't see this film being shot at $1 million. You've got that pretty elaborate boat scene at the beginning, a good number of people in that. The story jumps around different parts of the country, and a lot of the sets, they aren't as simple as an office or a house. So again, I just think it's a little much for $1 million. It's been years since I've seen the film, so I'd really have to go back and really watch it and kind of maybe break it down, at least in my mind, a little bit. But again, it doesn't strike me as a movie that could be done for $1 million. Now, interestingly, and this is the real point, and this is the reason why I want to bring this one up, is that interestingly, on Wikipedia, they list the budget as around $6 million, and that seems about right to me. It sort of passes the sniffs test. I think it's interesting to compare The Usual Suspects to Juno, at least in terms of the budget. With Juno, they list the budget, again, I mentioned this, at 6.5 to 7.5, so let's just call it $7 million. Which isn't too far off the $6 million that they're talking about for The Usual Suspects. But with Juno, they spent a lot of the money on the above-the-line talent, namely the cast, Jennifer Garner and Jason Bateman, and some of the other big stars. Again, Jennifer Garner and Jason Bateman, they were at the top of their game when this movie came out, when Juno came out. So that's their rate was as high as it was ever going to get. They probably worked for substantially less than their normal rate, but still a hefty sum of money and a hefty portion of the budget. So what does that mean? Usual Suspects spent about the same amount of money as a movie like Juno, but they spent a lot less money on cast. So what that means is that they spent a lot more money on production value. And if you watch these movies, go watch one, then go watch the other. Again, keeping in mind that the budget is about the same, you're going to see Usual Suspects, the production value is just much, much, much greater, much bigger. It just feels like a much bigger movie, yet they spent about the same amount of money. And that's the thing. Without the movie stars, you still have a chance that Juno you could end up with a really good film. In fact, you could probably get better actors. No disrespect to Jennifer Garner and Jason Bateman, but you could probably get very, very experienced actors who just simply aren't movie stars. They're not famous. They're not movie stars, but they're very experienced, competent actors, and you get them at a fraction of the cost of what they paid Jennifer Garner and Jason Bateman. There's a ton of these super talented actors out there. Usually they're British folks. And again, I don't think that would have impacted the quality of the film. But here's the thing about Jason Bateman's rate is based on how much value he brings in terms of marketing and selling the film. It's not necessarily the acting talent, and that's fine. People always bang on actors. Oh, this guy's a movie star. It's like they're not necessarily bringing their acting talent. Hopefully the two things are coupled. Hopefully the guy is a really good actor and he's got charisma that can bring butts into the seats. Those combinations of the two. But that's what you're paying a guy like Jason Bateman for. That's really what his rate is based on. It's not based on, wow, Jason Bateman is a better actor than Anthony Hopkins, therefore we should pay Jason Bateman more. Obviously, it would be an impossible equation to ever figure out, but more importantly, it's just not true, is that Jason Bateman is not necessarily considered an actor like Anthony Hopkins, but Jason Bateman, certainly at the top of his career, probably earned more money than that. So again, I think it's interesting to compare these two films. With The Usual Suspects, that's the route that they went. They didn't spend a ton of money on cast. I wouldn't say any of their cast was movie stars. Maybe Kevin Spacey, but he's always been one of those guys, that kind of the guys that I'm talking about, at least before the Me Too movement stuff, that was considered a great actor, sort of a great character actor, but not necessarily a huge box office draw. And you have those guys out there. So I doubt that they spent a ton of money on Kevin Spacey. He also wasn't the main lead in the movie, so you wouldn't have needed him for that much. So again, I don't think that they spent nearly as much on cast with The Usual Suspects. The budget ended up the same, but yet the movie for Usual Suspects, it feels like a much, much bigger thing. Here's the really important thing, though, that I'm really trying to kind of, bring home. The producers, they made this choice. They opted for less above the line budget to put more of their money into production value. And that's the thing. With The Usual Suspects, you can't just rewrite it and end up with essentially the same film and shoot it for $1 million. You can't like rewrite it so that, it's going to be, well, we'll rewrite this scene and rewrite this scene so that it can be cheaper. Like, if you started to do that, it would look cheap. It would feel cheap. It wouldn't have been the same film. One of the things The Usual Suspects was selling was the sort of the drama and the levity, and a lot of that is created in the production value, the lighting and the mood and the set, and you need that money, you need the time to be able to shoot that stuff. That's what that film is all about. That's what that film did well, and so you wouldn't want to shortchange that. Whereas with Juno, I think you could shortchange the cast and still end up with essentially a very, very good movie. A similar, essentially the same movie, but definitely you could still end up with a really, really good movie. I don't know that you're going to end up with a good movie on $1 million budget for The Usual Suspects. Okay, so let's talk about some movies that could clearly not be produced on a budget of $1 million. I'm just going to throw it. I know a lot of these examples are going to be obvious, but I just want to, again, just illustrate these examples using sort of some of the guidelines that I've laid out. So the Fast and the Furious franchise is a great example. Remember what I said earlier, danger is expensive. So the Fast and Furious films, obviously, tons of stunts, tons of danger. Part of what people are paying for with these films is the high-tech Daredevil stunts, the latest and the greatest, and you've got a whole movie chock full of them. It's not just one little scene at the beginning or the end. The whole movie, that's what it is. It's the Fast and the Furious racing their sporty little cars all over the place. And think about what a cheap version of the Fast and the Furious is. It's a ridiculous spoof. Like, that's the thing. It's not the Fast and the Furious. Juno is still Juno, even if you pull a lot of the money out. The Fast and the Furious is not still the Fast and the Furious if you pull the money out of it. So just in terms of my guidelines, lots of dangerous, expensive stunts and explosions. That's all going to be costly. Exotic locations. I think I've only seen one of the Fast and Furious movies, and I think part of it at least took place down in Brazil. So you've got like exotic locations, international productions. That's expensive. Airplanes, I think there was a helicopter in the one that I saw was pulling a safe. Maybe it was a truck. I don't know, but these are like really high-end stunts. Again, that stuff is very, very expensive. Again, I just want to reiterate, there is no $1 million version of the Fast and Furious that actually works. That's not a script that a low-budget producer is going to be interested in trying to tackle on a $1 million budget. You're not going to do a little rewrite and bring it under budget. It just simply doesn't work as a low-budget film. I want to lump all the recent Marvel movies into this category too. They're high-end. The people who go and see them, they want that high-end experience. It's not going to work with cheap, unrealistic special effects. That's why people are going to these movies and paying for them. They want to see spectacular, modern, the latest special effects. And this is nothing. This is nothing to say about the existing IP. Obviously, the Marvel films are based on the Marvel comics, and that's expensive. So if you have a film based on existing IP, it's probably not low budget. I get people asking me all the time about, I wrote a sequel to, this movie, or I wrote a movie based on this obscure Marvel comic. Well, there are no obscure Marvel comics anymore. I hate to tell you. And Marvel knows that every comic is a potential goldmine, and they're not going to just option, to a low budget producer to go do $1 million movie, especially in this day and age. I don't think anybody would really want to even go and attempt a superhero, a really like a legitimate. Obviously, if it's a spoof or something like that, you've got some different angle on it, maybe. But nobody's going to even attempt a superhero movie on $1 million budget because, again, it's just not. It's not going to be what audiences expect and want. It's not going to be a film that works. there is no $1 million of these Marvel superhero films, or I guess I should say there is. It's the 1970s Incredible Hulk starring Lou Ferrigno and Bill Bixby. And again, I don't think anyone has any interest in seeing that in the year 2020. I want to talk a bit about genre. Low budget doesn't have to mean sappy drama of people moping around a house. Low budget genre films is really where you stand the best chance of selling a screenplay. So don't think just because your script is an action film or a sci-fi script, it won't work. It quite possibly could. So let's dig into some of these examples for the genre films. Let's talk about action for a quick second. Check out Bloodsport. It's a 1988 Jean-Claude Van Damme film. The premise, gladiatorial fights to the death. It's really martial arts gladiatorial fights to the death in a modern day setting. It lends itself well to low budget fare because the fighting and action is so contained. All the action, all the fighting is in these cage matches, which is one warehouse where they build this one set. So we've literally seen this film a million times. So hopefully your premise is a little more original, but hopefully you'll get the idea. Again, just going through my little template. A movie like Bloodsport, it's contained. The action, hand-to-hand fighting can be cheap to produce. You don't need to pay a fire marshal to stand around in case your dynamite works a little better than expected. So again, martial arts, movies that require action, physical brawling, that kind of stuff is much, much cheaper. And Bloodsport is kind of, the real pinnacle of those types of movies. Another action movie, Assault on Precinct 13, is another great example of a low-budget action film. The original was actually done by John Carpenter in the 70s. Definitely a film that was less than $1 million. They did a remake a few years ago, which was obviously made for much more than $1 million. So those actually might be worth, if you want to, an interesting experiment might be to watch both versions and kind of see how they handled the budget discrepancies. But the bottom line is that an action film, bottom line is there could be an action film like this that could be shot for $1 million. Again, the basic premise lends itself to being low budget. The premise, in case you haven't heard of this film, is a street gang attacks a police precinct. So basically you have a bunch of good guys in the police station fighting an onslaught of thugs trying to get in. Again, this premise we've seen before. It's basically the Alamo, and in fact it's pretty much the movie 300 was basically a very similar premise, except there was 300 good guys. So the folks, but basically the folks on one side must defend against this onslaught. It's limited in scope. In this case, 300 I'd say was not so limited in scope. So it's the same basic premise, but you're limiting the scope down a little bit. In the case of Assault on Precinct 13, limited in scope. Basically it's one location, this police station that the thugs are trying to get into. There's going to be some gunshots in a movie like this, quite a bit of gunshots in fact, and that will cost you money. You will need to make sure you have all of that figured out production wise, but that's it. That's a movie like Assault on Precinct 13, you've got all your other boxes checked. It's limited location, limited cast, it's fairly contained, it's contemporary, there's not a lot of costumes or these things. The one thing you're going to have to pay for is the gunplay. It's just, there's no getting around it, and that's where you're going to spend your money. $1 million budget, that's where you're going to spend your money. You don't need the A-list, movie star cast. You just, but you could still do something like this very nicely for less than $1 million. So let's talk sci-fi. Again, obviously films like Star Wars are way over $1 million to produce. Alien, Avatar, Star Trek, the list goes on and on. These are big spectacle films, huge casts, which is expensive, incredible production design, all the spaceships, space suits, the building, the space interiors, exteriors, everything has to be designed and built. I love these films. I think it's super cool, but it's super expensive, obviously, to just manufacture all of that stuff. And then you're still dealing with all the really high-end special effects in post-production. Again, you've got the best post-production people, and you're going to have to pay them a pretty penny to make all of that stuff work. So pretty much everything in the Star Wars, mold is high-end. you'll notice though, again, an interesting aside, you'll notice with the Star Wars films, they don't really cast them with huge stars because they don't need them. They can bring in the audience without the cast. They get good actors, they get really great actors, and even the occasional cameo by a guy like Samuel L. Jackson, who is a movie star, doesn't really count in the context of Star Wars because he's got a very small role. And I can guarantee you, I don't know how much he got paid, but I can guarantee you he took less than his normal rate to do that. He just wanted to do a Star Wars movie, and probably, he has the clout to do it, so they cast him in a small role. But again, interestingly, they don't put cast because they can save money on the budget. There's no need to put Tom Cruise in your Star Wars movie. So the bottom line with these types of movies, you need a studio behind them. These are not independent films. These are super expensive, and with great expense comes great risk. And only a large studio or large company can shoulder that amount of risk. And even something like Star Wars, I know you think, oh, there's no risk, it's going to make billions of dollars. Even a film like that, when you talk about spending, hundreds of millions of dollars, it's enormous amount of risk. There's no low budget version of Star Wars. People want that experience, that high end experience with those movies. If you remove that, again, it would turn into literally a spoof of what it was supposed to be. Okay, so hopefully all that stuff is pretty obvious, but I don't want you to think that you can't make a cool sci-fi film for $1 million, because you most definitely can. Primer is considered by many to be one of the best indie films of all time. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. It's considered grounded sci-fi, meaning there's sci-fi elements to it, but it's still very much a contemporary story that takes place on modern day Earth. In other words, it's a sci-fi story, but it's grounded in sort of reality, today's reality. These films, sci-fi films, travel really well, meaning they do well in other countries, so they have a lot of potential upside. They're generally considered more upscale compared to like the low-budget horror or thriller films. They're typically a little smarter than other low-budget genres. The Platform, which I just mentioned, is a film over on Netflix, sort of falls into this mold. It's a great example of sort of a smart, interesting film. And what that does is it makes it a little more prestigious. And so what that does is it makes it a little more likely that you're going to get some better cast below their rates or with favorable rates. Let's put it to you like that. It's very difficult to get an actor to, a name actor to star in a schlocky horror movie because they're considered schlocky, and actors, for the most part, don't want to be associated with schlocky stuff. So sci-fi is an excellent low budget genre. But all the same factors basically exist. Larger casts are still expensive. If they all, if all your cast has these elaborate costumes, as in the case of something like Star Wars, that's expensive too. The Hunger Games comes to mind. Lots of crowd scenes. Things. I mean, these are expensive movies, not going to be cheap. There's a good sci-fi film called Monsters, about a couple that has to travel from Mexico to the United States after the world has been attacked by monsters, so they have to kind of go through the jungle and avoid these monsters. It was actually written and directed by Gareth Edwards, who went on to direct Rogue One. I actually thought that was the best of the new Star Wars movies. But this is a film that's definitely less than $1 million to produce. Sci-fi movie that's definitely less than $1 million, and it had some really high-end CGI. They did show the monsters, but they were very, very sparing with how often they showed them, and they really made the most of the small amount of CGI that they got to have. So again, this is a really good example of a sci-fi film that you should check out, and it's good to compare this film to something like Alien or even an Independence Day. It's a similar film, but it's a really scaled back, low budget version of it. It's a good film. It didn't look cheap either, and again, less than $1 million. But you'll notice with Monsters, there's no name cast. They kept things as contained as they could for the story, and did an excellent job with the special effects. My guess is they had somebody with some real experience with the special effects, because the special effects looked really good, and again, the budget I know was less than $1 million on that one. Okay, so last example, Stranger Things. I wanted to mention this because it's something I think most listeners have probably seen or at least heard of, and I think it's going to illustrate my main point to this whole video. Again, no real name cast. I mean, they had some cast, but it wasn't really needed. wasn't, I mean, Winona Ryder did a great job. She was great in it, but she didn't make it great. It wasn't Winona Ryder that made it great. So this is certainly a spot you could have cut on budget and probably still ended up with about the same quality product. Again, you get really experienced actors who are simply just not as famous as Winona Ryder, may or may not be, but probably be. You could probably even find some people that are better actors, and they'll work for a fraction of the cost. But honestly, the cast was so large with Stranger Things, the few stars they had probably didn't amount to that much in terms of the budget. But here's the bigger thing. Stranger Things isn't grounded in any way. It takes place in the 80s. All those costumes, houses, cars, everything, production design, all that stuff costs money. There's some pretty significant special effects that would be expensive. There's a million different locations. And again, all that has to be built and dressed. All the stuff in the Upside Down, that's not something you're going to find. You have to build all that stuff. Just the overall production value of the project is super high. The whole thing, despite being a TV show, feels very cinematic. Just watch it. They have big sweeping shots, lots of interesting coverage on every scene. It looks like a movie, a cinematic movie. And this just isn't cheap. I mean, that means a lot of production days. It means high-end equipment, high-end cameras, high-end camera rigs, all that stuff to get that really high-end production value. Just smooth camera moves, all that stuff just costs money. Now, as I said above, you could probably cut cast and get away with it, still end up with a decent film. But could you set Stranger Things in modern day and cut down the special effects, cut down the production value? Obviously, setting in modern day would cut a lot of the production design stuff. So if you set it in modern day and cut the special effects way down, could you do a low budget version of Stranger Things? Forget about the $1 million, because Stranger Things one season was 8 episodes, so it's not quite an apples to apples comparison. But I think it's going to illustrate my main point. Could you have cut Stranger Things down production value wise, and set it in a modern thing, done cheaper special effects, and would it still work? It's pretty simple otherwise. I mean, it's kids walking around. There is some stunts and stuff, but it's kids running around talking. And again, a lot of the sets are houses and stuff. They're just not, they're 1980s houses, so you'd have to really dress them. If you got contemporary houses, you could do a lot less of that. So the rest of the thing is not super hard. But the answer is obviously no. You cannot set Stranger Things in modern day and cut the special effects down and end up with something that is remotely similar to what they actually have. And that's the thing. What makes Stranger Things great, in my opinion, it's all the stuff that I mentioned that you can't cut. It's the fact that the story is an homage to the 1980s. The story wasn't anything super original or creative. I don't think the story would stand on its own. It's the context of the entire film, the entire TV show. It felt like a story from the 80s that was sort of simplistic and a little over the top by design. That's the way those stories were in the 80s. So it was a homage to that. If you did that in a modern setting, I think it would feel strange and just wouldn't have worked. It would have felt cheesy. And again, all that production value, all the 80s, the trinkets, the bikes. I just know, as someone who grew up in the 80s, I would look at all this stuff and you really feel the kids were wearing those vests that were popular in the 80s. You can see them in Back to the Future, actually. All that stuff was so 80s. That's what was great about the thing. It wasn't just the story or the script. If you start stripping those things away, all those things I mentioned, the production value, the period piece, you're going to end up with something completely different and not, I dare say it, what the writer had in mind. The writers, I guess in this case, had in mind. It wouldn't be as fun. It wouldn't be as interesting. It wouldn't be Stranger Things if you cut those things out. And that's really the main point I'm trying to make with this video. Is there a low budget version of your film? Is lack of money going to really diminish the possibility that your film will turn out well? There is a $100,000 version of Juno that could still be a really good film. There isn't a $100,000 version of The Avengers other than some sort of full-on spoof. Years ago, I read about this guy who shot an entire version, and don't quote me on the film, but I think he shot an entire version of Rambo. Like literally, he was an actor, he got a camera, he shot it with himself. I think he might have used some action figures, like to act against or something. And he did it by himself in his own apartment. I never saw it. It was sort of before stuff like YouTube. Maybe it's out there. If someone knows what I'm talking about, email me. I'd be curious to see it after all the years. But I heard, and this really dates it, I read about it. I think it was in Time Magazine. I think they actually mentioned it. But in any event, I heard about this thing, and it sounded really creative and interesting. You know, a one-man film, one-man band type film where he's using the script for Rambo. So, I mean, if this one guy is doing Rambo in his apartment, it seems logical that pretty much every single movie could be made on a budget of less than $1 million. And to some degree, that's true. But clearly, the guy who wrote Rambo was not thinking about the story in terms of some sort of an art project for an unemployed actor in New York. And that's the thing. You're the writer of your screenplay. So what do you have in mind for it? Do you see this? Do you see your film where there could be a low budget version of your script that's not an art house version like I'm talking about with this Rambo thing that could be made on a low budget? Hopefully I've outlined a few things to help you understand roughly where expenses can add up during production. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to be the one that has to decide if there's a good low budget version of your screenplay. And you should do this whether you enter this contest or not, because that's a conversation you're going to want to have with the producer. If a producer contacts you, I love your script, I want to make it, you need to have this conversation before you option the script to him. And you need to say, well, what kind of budget do you think you're going to raise? And you may be expecting, oh, this is a $50 million movie. And he may come to you, oh, 500,000. It was like, well, no, that's not the story that you've written. And that's totally okay. Not, a low budget script is not better than a high budget script or vice versa. I mean, it's more about the story, and what your story is about. Can your story be made? Can it be made on a low budget and still stand a chance of being a good version of your screenplay? And this shouldn't be I'm a desperate screenwriter, I'll take any credit. You should really look at your story and ask yourself that. Where do you see this film? How do you see this film being produced? What in your head, what do you picture as the end product? That's going to be the determining factor ultimately on budget, more than any other single thing. Again, there's some common sense guidelines. Hopefully I've laid those out. Definitely you want to apply those. You definitely want to think about those things. But at the end of the day, some of this is going to come down to how creative your producer is and what you want for your material. Anyways, hopefully that was valuable. You got some good information to help you start to determine what the budget potentially could be for your screenplay. Once again, if you have any interest in entering the SYS Six-Figure Screenplay Contest, just go to sellingyourScreenplay.com/contest. If you have any questions about this, I'm always open for a conversation. You can leave a comment here on YouTube. I try and answer those comments, or you can send an email to us, info@sellingyourscreenplay.com. I answer for the most part all the email that comes in, so I'm happy to engage with people, and if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to answer those as well. Anyways, thank you for listening to this, and hopefully you got some value out of it.